The most feared crime boss in Seoul spent 6 years building an empire that no rival could touch, no government could break, and no rival family dared to challenge. He survived assassinations, betrayals, and wars fought in the dark. But on the night of his 5th wedding anniversary, the only person who ever made him human quietly removed her wedding ring, set it on the table, and walked out the front door without looking back. And before sunrise, every criminal in Seoul knew the mafia boss's wife had left him, which meant she was no longer protected. She was a target. If you've ever loved someone you couldn't protect, stay until the very end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The dinner had been set since 6 in the evening. 2 white plates arranged on a linen cloth Naomi had ironed herself, because the housekeeper had offered and she'd sent her home early. She wanted the apartment quiet. She wanted it to feel like theirs instead of like a showroom where important men came to negotiate things she was never allowed to hear. She'd lit 4 candles, opened a bottle of wine, put on the kind of music that didn't demand anything from you. Low and unhurried, drifting through the penthouse like something that had gotten lost and was in no rush to find its way out. She sat down at 7. She ate a few bites at 8, alone, standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table by herself felt like rehearsing for something she didn't want to name. By 10, she had stopped checking her phone. By midnight, the candles had burned themselves down to nothing, and the wax had dripped and hardened in small, pale pools around the base of each holder, and both plates were cold, and neither of them had been touched. She covered them with dish towels. She didn't know why. She wasn't saving the food. She wasn't delusional. She'd done this before, covered things that were finished as though covering them made them less finished. Naomi Brooks had been married to Kang Min-jae for 5 years. She had known him for 6. She had loved him in some form or another since the 2nd month of knowing him, which she had spent a great deal of energy trying to talk herself out of, because she was a practical woman with a graduate degree and a career she'd built with her own hands, and enough self-awareness to understand that falling in love with a man who moved through a room the way a pressure change moved through a building, quietly, invisibly, and felt in the chest before it was ever understood, was not the kind of decision a practical woman made on purpose. She made it anyway. She moved to Seoul from Atlanta 3 years before they married, following a community architecture fellowship that placed her in neighborhoods the rest of the city had decided to forget. She'd been good at the work. She'd always been good at work. At reading a space, at understanding what a block of city could become if someone was patient with it, at sitting with struggling community groups and listening long enough to hear what they were actually asking for underneath what they said they needed. She had a particular talent for neglected things. Min-jae had noticed that about her before she'd noticed anything about him. He had a way of watching that didn't feel like surveillance. Most powerful men she'd met in her life, and she'd met several, though none like him, watched you to assess what you could do for them. Min-jae watched like he was trying to understand something, like the act of looking carefully enough might eventually explain what he was seeing. She'd found it disarming. She'd been wrong to find it disarming. The apartment was 52 floors above Seoul. Floor-to-ceiling glass on the south face looked out over a city that never fully darkened. The kind of skyline that threw light upward as much as down, so the clouds at night always had a faint amber rim, like the city was running a low fever that nobody was trying to cure. She stood at the glass for a long time after the candles went out. She watched the city. The city didn't watch back. That was one thing you could say for it. She heard the elevator at 2:17 in the morning. She recognized the particular sound of it, the subtle shift in the air pressure of the apartment before the doors opened, the weight change in the floor that only happened when the private lift was in use. She had not moved from the window. She did not move now. She listened to him cross the foyer. She listened to the particular quality of his footsteps and understood from them, without turning around, that he was injured, not badly, not in a way that would require a hospital, but in the way that made a man set his feet down more deliberately than usual, distributing weight with the kind of conscious attention that pain teaches you. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. A long silence. "Naomi." She turned around then. He was standing with one hand on the doorframe. His jacket was gone. His dress shirt was torn at the right shoulder, and there was dried blood on the collar, Not a dramatic amount, just enough. His left eye was swollen along the lower lid in a way that would be worse tomorrow. He looked at the two covered plates on the table, and then he looked at her, and his expression did what it always did when he came home like this. It closed. Shut down, sealed from the outside, the way a good building battens against weather. "I'm sorry," he said. Those two words, she had heard them so many times she had begun to hear them differently than other people heard apologies. Most apologies asked for something: forgiveness, patience, another chance. Min Jae's apologies didn't ask for anything. They were more like a report, a status update. "I am sorry. The condition exists." He acknowledged it the way a person acknowledges rain. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the table, and she reached up, and she removed her wedding ring. It took a second. It always came off easily. She had lost a little weight over the past year, and the ring had grown slightly loose, something she'd meant to have adjusted and hadn't. She set it on the table beside the covered plate. It made a very small sound against the linen, a sound you would not have heard if the room hadn't been so quiet. Min Jae's eyes went to the ring, then back to her. "I gave you everything," Naomi said. Her voice was not shaking. She had rehearsed this conversation so many times inside her own head that the words had lost their heat, which was maybe worse than if they'd come out ragged and furious. They came out clear, measured, like a conclusion that had been a long time in the arriving. "I gave you everything, and you never trusted me with the truth. Not once in 6 years. Not with anything real. You kept me in a beautiful box, Min Jae, and you locked it, and you told yourself that was love." He didn't answer. He never answered when she said things like that. Not because he disagreed. She understood now, in the way you only understand things once you've stopped hoping for a different answer, that he didn't respond because he agreed and had no defense to offer, and was too proud to say so. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd left it hours ago, when she'd still had some version of hope that the evening would go differently. "Don't follow me," she said. "Don't send anyone. I mean it." She walked to the elevator. She did not look back. The doors closed. The city received her at 2:30 in the morning, glittering and indifferent, and Naomi Brooks breathed in the night air on the sidewalk in front of the building and stood there for a moment with the wind in her face, 52 floors below the life she had just walked out of, and felt something that wasn't quite freedom and wasn't quite grief, but was somewhere between the two in that no man's land where major decisions live before your body has caught up with what your mind already knows. She flagged a cab. She left. By morning, the story had traveled the way stories travel in the world Min Jae inhabited. Not through phone calls or texts, nothing as traceable as that, but through a system of glances and absences and very specific silences in very specific rooms. A car that should have been in front of the building at 6 and wasn't. A security rotation that shifted by 8 minutes and nobody said why. A housekeeper who arrived at 9 and was turned away at the door. The Korean Mafia Boss's wife had left him. Within 48 hours, every significant criminal organization in Seoul knew. What they understood, what Naomi did not yet understand, was that she had just become the most dangerous person in the city, not because of who she was, but because of what she meant. Because the one thing that every experienced predator in any environment learns to look for is not strength. Strength can be met with strength. What predators look for is the specific, identifiable point at which a powerful creature can be made to hurt. Min Jae had ruled Seoul's underworld for more than a decade. He had survived things that should not have been survivable. He had built an organization that operated across 6 different industries in 3 countries and had allies in places that did not officially acknowledge having allies anywhere. He was not a man who had obvious weaknesses. Until now. Now the weakness had a name, an address, and a face that was very easy to describe. Naomi moved into the spare room above her older sister Ji Young's garage. Ji Young had married a Korean man a year before Naomi met Min Jae, had settled in Seoul, and was the reason Naomi had come to Korea at all. The room was small. It smelled like paint and old wood and the particular dry cold of an uninsulated space in early winter. There was a radiator that worked intermittently and a window that looked out over a narrow alley and a convenience store with a sign that buzzed in the dark. She unpacked 2 bags. She turned down the money. Min Jae had arranged for funds to be transferred to an account in her name before the end of the first day. She didn't know how he'd done it so quickly, but she knew he'd done it because she checked the account and saw it there. 7 figures, waiting. She moved the money back within the hour. She didn't send a message with it. The act itself was the message. She understood him well enough to know he would read it correctly. She called her firm in Atlanta, not the Seoul practice, the original one she'd built with 2 colleagues before she'd ever heard of Kang Min Jae, and told them she was available. They had a project. They always had projects for her. This one was in a neglected district on Seoul's east side, a neighborhood that had been flagged for redevelopment 3 times in the past decade and bypassed all 3 times when the money found more profitable uses. There was an abandoned community arts center at the district's center. The building had good bones, bad plumbing, and a history that the community remembered and the city had tried to forget. Naomi went and looked at it the morning after she moved into Ji Young's spare room. She stood in front of it in the gray early winter light, hands in her coat pockets, and looked at the facade for a long time. The windows were boarded. There was graffiti on the lower panels that was neither particularly good nor particularly bad, but had the desperate energy of someone who needed to put something somewhere and didn't have many options. The front steps were cracked. A plastic bag moved through the forecourt in a slow circle, pushed by wind that couldn't decide where it was going. She thought, this is fixable. This is what she did. She found broken things and figured out what they needed. She'd been doing it for 20 years, to buildings and communities, and she understood now with a clarity that was uncomfortable, to relationships. She had spent 6 years trying to fix a marriage to a man who had never once led her close enough to understand where it was actually broken. She went inside. The interior was worse than the exterior and better than she'd feared. The main hall had a collapsed section of ceiling in the northwest corner, water damage along the east wall, flooring that would need to come up entirely. But the structural walls were solid. The roof, where it hadn't collapsed, was intact. And the light, there were high clerestory windows along both sides of the main hall that had been boarded from the outside but were unbroken. And when Naomi found a side door and got it open and stood inside looking up, she could see where the light would come in if someone let it. She spent 3 hours in the building. She came out and called the project coordinator and said she was taking the job. She did not know, standing on those cracked front steps with her phone in her hand and her breath clouding in the cold air, that 2 men were watching from a car parked at the corner of the block. She did not know their names. She did not know that they reported to Min Jae's most trusted lieutenant, a man named Ryun, who reported directly to Min Jae himself. She did not know that by the time she flagged a cab back to Ji Young's garage, 3 separate potential threats in the immediate vicinity had been assessed, 2 of which had been resolved through means that left no trace, and 1 of which had been frightened off by a method that was somewhat more direct but equally invisible to any outside observer. She felt none of this. She felt watched, occasionally, a prickling at the back of the neck that she attributed to living newly alone after 6 years of never being truly alone, of always having security in some form or another. She told herself it was adjustment. She told herself the city felt different when you moved through it without the weight of who you were married to. She was not wrong about that last part. It did feel different. She was wrong about the first part. Inside the syndicate, meanwhile, the silence was different in quality from the one in the penthouse 52 floors above Seoul. The silence inside Min Jae's organization was the silence of men calculating. There were 4 major rival organizations in Seoul, and 2 of them had been watching Min Jae's marriage with the patient, specialized attention that experienced predators give to the slow emergence of a wound in something large and powerful. They had noted the rumors over the years, the strains in the marriage, the absences, the particular kind of careful public composure that signals a private situation that is not under control. They had filed the information and waited. They were no longer waiting, but the threat that emerged first was not external. It came from inside. The man who sat at the head of the organization's founding council, the chairman, an older man named Baek Sung-hyun, who had helped Min Jae build the syndicate from a much smaller, much less elegant operation 15 years earlier, summoned Min Jae to a meeting at a private restaurant 3 days after Naomi left. The restaurant was closed to the public for the evening. There were 12 men around the table. Sung-hyun sat at the end with the particular still authority of someone who has been powerful long enough that he no longer needs to perform it. You look worse than I expected, the old man said, looking at Min Jae's eye. I look fine, Min Jae said. You look like a man who just lost control of his house. Sung Hyun poured tea for himself, not for Min Jae. Which is unfortunate, because men who lose control of their house have trouble convincing anyone they still have control of anything else. My personal life is my personal life. Nothing about your life is personal. The old man set down his cup. The room was quiet. The 12 men around the table were very still. You married an outsider, an American woman with no connection to any family we know. We accepted this because you were in a period of expansion and sentiment is useful in small doses for keeping loyalty. But you kept her too close. You let her matter too much. And now she's gone. And every family in the city is looking at the space where she used to be and thinking about what can fit in that space. Min Jae said nothing. We need you to make a statement, Sung Hyun said. A clear one. That the woman is not your concern anymore. That whatever she was, she isn't now. That you are focused. And what kind of statement did you have in mind? The kind that closes doors. The old man looked at him steadily. She shouldn't be able to move freely in this city as though she's protected. If she's protected, you're still attached. If you're still attached, you're still vulnerable. And if you're vulnerable, I understand what vulnerable means, Min Jae said quietly. Then you understand what I'm asking. The room waited. Min Jae picked up his own cup of tea and looked at it for a moment. No, he said. The single word landed in the room like something that had been dropped from a significant height. Sung Hyun looked at him for a long time. Think carefully about what you're choosing, the old man said. I have. Min Jae set down the cup. She left. That was her choice, and I won't undo it, but I won't make her a target either. Anyone who moves toward her moves toward me. That hasn't changed. He stood up. We're done for tonight, he said. He walked out. Nobody at the table spoke for a long time after he left. Outside the restaurant, in the cold night air, Min Jae stood on the sidewalk and let the coldness of it reach him. His face was controlled. His breathing was controlled. He had spent 20 years cultivating the ability to perform control regardless of what was happening underneath it, and he performed it now the way he always did, completely, without visible seam. But his hands, in the pockets of his coat where no one could see them, were not entirely steady. Because Sung Hyun was right about one thing. Naomi was no longer protected the way she had been. She was out in the city, in a neighborhood he hadn't secured, living in a building with no surveillance and no security, going to a job site every day that was visible from the street. He had people watching. But watching was not the same as safe. And then, 6 days after Naomi walked out, an envelope arrived. It came through a channel that should not have existed. A channel that Min Jae had believed was known only to himself, his lieutenant Ryun, and 2 other men who had been with him since the beginning. It arrived sealed, without identification, containing only a single item, a photograph of a document. Financial records 6 years old, standard shipping paperwork from a subsidiary company, the kind of thing that crossed his desk by the hundreds in those years when the organization was growing fast and the administrative side was trying to catch up. But someone had circled a line item in red, and in the margin, in handwriting he did not recognize, were 5 words. She saw it. She always knew. Min Jae read the note 3 times. Then he sat down. He sat in his office for 47 minutes without moving, and then he reached for his phone, and he called the one number he had promised himself he would not call. And when it rang 4 times and went to voicemail, he listened to her voice on the outgoing message. Professional, clear, a little warm at the edges. And he said, in a voice that was the most uncontrolled thing he had produced in years, I need to see you. I know you said don't call. I know. But there's something you need to know, and I need to tell you before someone else does. And I need you to believe that everything I'm about to say, everything I hid from you, I hid because I thought it would keep you alive. He paused. Please, call me back. He hung up. Naomi heard the message at 8 in the morning, standing in the shell of the art center with plaster dust on her coat and a coffee going cold in her hand. And she listened to it twice, and she felt the precise particular fear that comes not from what a person says, but from how they sound when they say it. In 6 years, she had never once heard Kang Min-jae's voice sound like that. She stood in the empty building and looked at her phone for a long time. Naomi called him back at 9:14 in the morning. She didn't plan to. She stood in the art center for 40 minutes after listening to the voicemail a second time, drinking cold coffee and watching the dust settle from where one of the contractors had knocked plaster off a section of east wall. And she told herself she wasn't going to call, that whatever he needed to tell her could be delivered through a lawyer or written down and sent through someone else. That she had made a decision, and the decision had cost her enough already that reversing it before the bruise had even fully formed would be its own kind of damage. Then she called him. He picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" he said. "That's not how this starts," she said. "You called me. You talk first." A pause. She heard him breathe. That was unusual. Min-jae was not a man whose breathing you heard. He was too controlled for that, too practiced in the architecture of composure. Hearing his breath come through the phone slightly uneven was the kind of thing that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Not on the phone," he said. "Then we don't talk." "Naomi, I'm not going back to the apartment," she said. "I'm not meeting you somewhere you've chosen and secured. You want to tell me something. You tell me somewhere I pick, somewhere public, and you come alone." Another pause, longer this time. "Where?" he said. She thought for a moment. "The covered market on Yulji Row, the one with the tea stalls on the lower level, noon." She hung up before he could respond. She spent the time between the call and noon trying to work. She walked the east wall with the structural engineer, a methodical woman named Park Soo-jin, who communicated primarily through clipboard annotations and disapproving sounds. And they talked about load-bearing potential and moisture remediation, and Naomi took notes and asked the right questions. And none of it touched the part of her mind that was already sitting at a table in a covered market watching a doorway. She arrived 12 minutes early. She chose a table that put her back to a solid wall and gave her sightlines to both entrances. She had not consciously decided to do this. She had simply done it, the way you absorb certain habits from 6 years of proximity to someone who is always thinking about exits. Min-jae arrived at noon exactly. He was alone. He wore a dark coat she didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought it recently, which meant he was trying not to be recognized in it. He scanned the market floor in a single practice sweep and found her in 3 seconds. He crossed the space between them without looking at anything else. He sat down across from her. He looked worse than he had at 2 in the morning 2 weeks ago. His eye had healed, but there was something else. A hollowness in the face that she associated not with violence but with sleeplessness, which was in some ways more alarming. Min-jae had slept through things that would have kept any reasonable person staring at a ceiling. If he wasn't sleeping now, the weight of whatever he was carrying was something she hadn't encountered in him before. She didn't say any of that. "Talk," she said. He put an envelope on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't touch it. "What is that?" "A photograph of a financial document, 6 years old." He kept his hands flat on the table, which she recognized as deliberate. He was controlling his hands because he needed her to be able to see them. "Someone sent it to me through a channel that shouldn't exist, through a communication route that I believed was known only to 4 people, including me." "What does the document say?" "It's a shipping manifest from a subsidiary we were running in 2019, routine paperwork." He paused. "Except someone circled a line item and wrote a note in the margin." "What kind of note?" He looked at her directly. "It says you saw it, that you always knew." Naomi looked back at him for a long moment. The market moved around them. The low hum of vendor conversations, the smell of something frying somewhere down the row, the particular warm cold of an enclosed market in winter. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. She looked at the photograph inside, and something happened in her chest that was not quite recognition, but was close enough to it that her hands tightened slightly on the paper. "I remember this," she said. Min-jae said nothing. "I helped you organize paperwork that night. It was in the early months after we moved in together. You had a stack of files you'd brought home, and I was trying to do something useful, and you let me sort them." She was looking at the photograph, but she was seeing something else. Something 6 years back. There was a discrepancy in the tonnage figures. I noticed it, and I mentioned it, and you... She looked up. "You said it was a clerical error." "It wasn't a clerical error," Min-jae said. The market hummed. A vendor 2 stalls down laughed at something. "Tell me what it was," Naomi said. He told her. He told her in the flat, precise way that he described things when he had decided to be fully truthful about them. No softening, no strategic omissions, no version of events shaped for a particular effect. She had heard him speak this way in business contexts and understood it as the voice he used when the cost of imprecision was too high to risk. He used it now. The discrepancy in the tonnage figures was not clerical. It was deliberate. It was the signature of a financial channel that 3 of his most trusted lieutenants had constructed in secret over the preceding 18 months, a parallel funding stream, drawing money from the organization's northern operations and redirecting it to a rival family. Not for personal gain, for leverage. For the architecture of a transfer of power that would have removed Min-ji from the organization's leadership and replaced him with a figure more acceptable to the rival interests who were funding the coup. Naomi's innocent observation, mentioned once in passing while sorting paperwork on a Tuesday evening, had been specific enough that Min-ji had known where to look. He had spent 3 weeks quietly investigating before the 3 lieutenants understood that their channel had been found. The coup had been dismantled. The 3 men had been handled in ways that Naomi had never been told about and would not be told about now. And then he had erased everything that connected her to the discovery. Every document bearing her name, every record of the evening, every reference to the conversation. He had constructed a version of those 3 weeks in which Naomi did not exist, in which the discovery had been made through an internal audit, in which she had played no role at all. "Why?" she said. Her voice was very even. "Because if anyone in the organization understood that you had exposed the coup, accidentally, without even knowing what you were looking at, you would have become a target for every person connected to those 3 men, and beyond them, for every family that had backed the operation." He held her gaze. "The information would have made you the most dangerous civilian in Seoul. I couldn't protect you from that. The only protection that worked was making sure no one ever knew." Naomi set the photograph down on the table. She set it down carefully, like something that might be fragile, even though it was just paper. "So you kept me safe," she said. "Yes." "By keeping me ignorant." "Yes." "For 6 years." He didn't answer. The answer was in the question. "And the anniversary," she said. "That night, was that connected to this?" Something moved in his face, brief, controlled almost immediately. "I was meeting with Sung Hyun. There was information that suggested someone was moving the old records, that someone inside the organization had found the material I'd buried." He stopped. "I should have come home anyway. I should have told you I needed to leave. I chose wrong." "You've always chosen wrong," Naomi said, "just in different ways." "I know. You chose my safety over my dignity, over my intelligence, over my right to know what I was living in the middle of." She wasn't raising her voice. This was worse than raised voices. She was speaking quietly and completely. "I didn't need you to protect me from information, Min-jae. I needed you to trust me with it. There's a difference. If I had told you, you don't know what would have happened if you'd told me. You decided. You decided without me. And then you lived the decision for 6 years and let me live inside the consequences of it without explaining a single thing." She looked at him. "Do you understand what that feels like? To be kept safe, like an object. Something you lock in a case because it's valuable to you and you don't want it to get damaged." Min-jae's jaw was tight. "I know what it looks like." "I don't think you do." She put the photograph back in the envelope. She put the envelope on the table in front of him. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I mean that. It matters that you told me." She stood up. "But it doesn't change what's broken, Min-jae. Because the problem was never that I was in danger. The problem is that you decided, alone every time about every single thing, what I was allowed to know about my own life." She picked up her coat. "Go figure out who sent you that envelope," she said. "That sounds like a problem for someone with an empire." She walked out. She made it to the end of the block before her legs felt unreliable enough that she stopped and stood against a building wall in the cold and breathed. Just breathed. In and out, slowly, counting nothing, feeling the cold concrete of the wall through her coat. Around her, the street did what streets did, indifferent and continuous. She thought about the night she'd sorted the paperwork. She remembered it clearly now. A Tuesday. She'd been wearing the old university sweatshirt she still owned, one of only 3 things she'd brought from Atlanta that wasn't professional clothing. Min-jae had been on the phone most of the evening, and she'd seen the stack of folders on the desk, and she'd thought, in the simple way that you think things at the beginning of a relationship when you are trying to figure out how to be useful to someone whose world you don't yet understand, that she could help. She'd organized the folders. She'd noticed the discrepancy. She'd mentioned it the same way you mentioned that someone has a coffee stain on their shirt. She had noticed it, and she had forgotten it. She had forgotten it, and it had saved his life. And he had spent 6 years carrying that knowledge and never once told her. She pushed off the wall and started walking. She walked for 40 minutes, longer than she needed to, until the cold worked its way through the coat, and she stopped being angry and started being tired, which was at least more productive. She went back to the arts center. Sujin had left notes on the east wall in careful handwriting, measurements and observations, a small diagram of the water damage pattern. Naomi stood in front of the wall and read the notes and thought about load bearing, about what a structure could hold, about what it couldn't. She went home. She did not sleep well that night. She was at the center by 7 the next morning, which was earlier than any of the contractors, and she was standing in the main hall alone, looking at the boarded clerestory windows and calculating what the light would do when they opened them up, when she heard the door. She turned around. It was not a contractor. It was a man she didn't recognize. 30s, nondescript coat, the specific quality of stillness that she had learned over 6 years to associate with men who worked for Min-jae. He stood in the doorway without coming further in. His hands were visible. His expression was neutral in the way that careful neutrality looked when it was being performed. "Mrs. Kang," he said. "Brooks," she said. "What do you want?" "I work for Mr. Kang. My name is Ryeon. I think you've heard it." She had. Min-jae's most trusted lieutenant. She had never met him. She had understood, in the abstracted way she understood most of what surrounded her husband's business, that Ryeon existed and that he occupied a position of significant trust in the organization. "He didn't send me," Ryeon said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. He doesn't know I'm here." "Then why are you here?" Ryeon looked at the floor for a moment, not avoiding her eyes, just choosing his next words with the kind of care that suggested he'd been standing outside the building for some time before he came in. "The envelope that was sent to him," he said. "I need to know if he told you about it." "Why?" "Because I sent it." The hall was very quiet. "Why?" Naomi said again. "Because I've worked for Min-jae for 11 years, Ryeon said, and in 11 years I've watched him protect you in every way except the one that mattered. I've also watched what's been building inside the organization for the past 3 months, and I understand what it means that the old record surfaced now." He looked at her steadily. "Someone inside leaked your connection to the 2019 discovery. Not to Min-jae, to the outside. The envelope I sent him was a warning. I needed him to understand how exposed the information was before he heard it from someone who planned to use it as a weapon." The cold in the building was different from the cold outside, still old. "Who leaked it?" Naomi said. "I don't know yet. I have 3 possibilities and I'm working to narrow them." He paused. "But whoever it was, they didn't stop at leaking it internally. The rival families know, or will know very shortly." He looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was completely without softening. "What that means practically is that you are no longer safe in this city in the way that you were this morning. Not because of who you were married to, because of what you accidentally saw 6 years ago." Naomi stood in the empty hall and looked at this man she'd never met. "Does Min-jae know that the rival families have it?" she said. "Not yet." "How long do we have before they move?" Ryeon looked slightly surprised. "Not much." It was a controlled expression, but she caught it. "Days. Possibly less." "Then you need to tell him," she said. "Whatever you came here to tell me, go tell him instead." "I came here to warn you." "I'm warned." She looked at him. "Now go warn him." Ryeon looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once. He turned and walked to the door. "Ryeon," she said. He stopped. "Why does he trust you?" she said. Ryun considered the question. Because I've never lied to him, he said, even when the truth cost me something. He left. Naomi stood alone in the hall for a long time. Then she took out her phone and she called Ji Young. Ji Young answered on the second ring, already alert in that way of hers that suggested she hadn't been fully asleep for some time. She was the kind of woman who moved through life at a heightened state of readiness, which Naomi had always found both reassuring and exhausting. Something's happening, Naomi said. I don't know all of it yet. I need you to go to your mother-in-law's house today. Not tomorrow. Today. A silence. Then, how bad? I don't know. Probably not. Probably nothing happens to you. You're not the one they want, but I need you out of your house as a precaution, and I need you to trust me without me explaining everything right now. Naomi, Ji Young, please. Another silence. Okay, Ji Young said finally. Okay. Today. Thank you. She hung up. She called Min Jae next. He answered before the first ring had finished. Ryun came to see you, he said. Not a question. You knew? I have a car outside the building. I know who goes in. A pause. He told you that the rival families have the records. Yes. The silence on his end was the particular texture of a man recalculating under pressure. She could almost feel the quality of it through the phone, the way a shift in air pressure has a feeling before you can name the source. You need to leave the neighborhood, he said. I know. I can have... No, she said. Not your people, not your cars. I'll handle where I go. She paused. But there are teenagers who come to this building after school, a group that started showing up 2 weeks ago. They've been working on a mural on the west interior wall, and they don't know anything about what's happening, and I need someone to make sure they don't come here tonight. A very brief silence. I'll make sure, he said. Okay? Naomi. His voice changed in some register she couldn't name. I'm going to fix this. I know you think that, she said. She hung up. She looked around the hall one more time. The water-stained east wall, Soo-jin's careful notes, the start of the mural on the west side that the teenagers had begun, broad strokes of color that were beginning to look like something even if you couldn't yet tell what. She picked up her bag. She was almost at the door when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. 7 words. Don't trust anyone he sends to protect you. She stopped moving. She read it again. Outside the building, the street looked exactly as it always looked. The convenience store, the narrow alley, the ordinary motion of an ordinary block in an ordinary part of the city. But her body understood something that her mind was still catching up to, a cold certainty spreading from the center of her chest outward. Someone who knew where she was, and knew about Ryun's visit, and knew about Min Jae's operation, someone with that level of access, had just told her not to trust the people Min Jae was about to send, which meant the breach wasn't just inside the organization. It was close. Naomi stood in the doorway of the art center and read the message 4 times. 7 words on a screen from a number that didn't exist in any contact list, from a person she couldn't name, who knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. She looked up from the phone and looked at the street. The convenience store. A woman walking a small dog. A delivery truck idling at the corner with its hazards on. Everything ordinary. Everything exactly as it should look if someone had arranged for it to look that way. She went back inside. She stood in the middle of the main hall and thought carefully, the way she thought through structural problems. Not emotionally, not reactively, but with the specific patience of someone who understood that the first reading of a damaged building was almost never the accurate one. You had to look past the obvious failure to find the original flaw. Someone with access to Min Jae's internal communication channels had sent him the envelope. Ryun had confirmed he was the sender. But someone else, someone with knowledge of Ryun's visit, of the building's location, of the rival family's movements, had just told her not to trust the people Min Jae would send. 2 sources. Opposite instructions. One of them was lying, or both of them were telling the truth about different things. She took the battery out of her phone. It was an old habit she hadn't practiced in years, something Min Jae had taught her in the first year of their marriage, almost casually, the way he taught her things he considered basic. If you don't know who is looking, remove what they can look through. She'd stopped doing it years ago because she'd stopped thinking of herself as someone anyone would bother to look at. She did it now without deliberation, her fingers finding the familiar motion, and she put the phone and the battery in separate pockets of her coat. She left through the service entrance at the back. She walked 4 blocks east, turned north, walked another 3. She bought a prepaid phone from a small electronics vendor who asked no questions because no questions were required for a cash transaction involving cheap hardware. She put a SIM card in it, powered it on, and called the one number she had memorized rather than stored. Ji Young answered in 2 rings. "Are you at your mother-in-law's?" Naomi said. "I'm getting in the car right now." "What is happening, Naomi? You need to—" "I'll explain later." "Are you alone in the car?" "Yes." "Drive somewhere crowded. A shopping center, a market, anywhere with a lot of people and multiple exits. Stay in public. Don't go home tonight." "You're scaring me." "Good," Naomi said. "Stay scared until I tell you otherwise. It'll keep you sharp." She hung up. She was 2 blocks from a subway entrance. She went down. She spent the next 40 minutes on trains going nowhere in particular, switching lines twice, sitting in the middle of cars, watching doors, cataloging faces. Nobody followed her. Or nobody followed her badly enough to be seen, which was not the same as nobody following her. She understood the difference now in a way she hadn't 6 years ago. She got off at a station 3 neighborhoods from the art center and walked to a coffee shop she had never been to before. She sat in the back. She ordered something she didn't drink. She sat with the new phone on the table in front of her and thought about who to call. Min-jae was compromised in ways she didn't fully understand yet. Ryun might be trustworthy or might be the source of the breach. He'd admitted to sending the envelope, which was either an act of loyalty or an act of manipulation that she didn't have enough information to evaluate. The message from the unknown number had warned her away from Min-jae's people, but the message itself came from an unknown source with unknown motivations, which made it no more inherently trustworthy than anything else. She had nobody to call. The understanding arrived without drama. She sat with it. This was what it looked like. The inside of the life she'd been living without knowing she was living it. A coffee shop, a prepaid phone, no one she could safely reach. 6 years of marriage to a man who had built his world in such a way that her only options, when the world turned dangerous, were to trust him or to trust no one. She had chosen no one. She wasn't sure yet if that was brave or foolish. She suspected it was both. Her prepaid phone rang. She stared at it. The number was blocked. She let it ring twice more, then answered. "You took the battery out," a voice said. Male, middle-aged, the specific flatness of someone accustomed to conversations that didn't have room for social lubrication. "Who is this?" she said. "Someone who sent you a message an hour ago. Someone who would like to have a conversation with you before the people who are currently looking for you find this coffee shop." The cold that moved through her was physical, scalp to spine. "How do you know where I am?" she said. "Because I've been watching you since you left the center, not to harm you, to make sure you weren't followed by anyone else before I made contact." A pause. "You're good at moving through a city. Better than most civilians. Your husband taught you some things. What do you want?" "To talk. Specifically to tell you something about the man you're currently trying to decide whether to trust." "You're going to need to be more specific about which man." "Ryeon," the voice said. "Lee Ryeon, Min-jae's most trusted lieutenant, 11 years of service, the man who told you this morning that he sent the envelope as a warning." A brief pause. "He lied." The coffee shop moved around her. Someone laughed near the front. The espresso machine hissed. "Explain," she said. "Ryeon didn't send the envelope to warn Min-jae. He sent it to flush you out. He needed to know whether Min-jae would tell you about the 2019 records, whether Min-jae trusted you enough to share that information. Once he knew that Min-jae had told you and that you knew the shape of what you'd accidentally exposed, he needed to assess whether you were a threat that needed to be managed directly." Another pause. His visit to the arts center this morning was not an act of loyalty. It was reconnaissance. She realized she was pressing her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger hard enough to leave a mark. She stopped. "Who are you?" she said again. "My name is Detective Sergeant O.J. Wan, Financial Crimes Division. I've been building a case against Kang Min-jae's organization for 3 years. A beat. I've also been building a secondary case, one that my supervisors don't know about yet, against the people inside that organization who have been selling information to rival families and to certain figures in this city who would very much like Min-jae's operation dismantled without the inconvenience of a legal process. Naomi was quiet. Ryun is on that secondary list, Oh Jae-won said. He has been for 7 months. He's been the source of the internal leaks, not just the 2019 records. Everything. Operational security details, safe house locations, the names of protected witnesses in 2 separate investigations. His voice was careful, precise. He has been systematically destroying Min-jae's organization from the inside while maintaining Min-jae's complete trust. And now that the rival families have the information they need, the next phase is to create a situation in which you are used as leverage. To do what? Naomi said, though she already knew. To force Min-jae to step down, to surrender the northern operations, to walk away from an organization that has taken decades to build. Oh Jae-won paused. If he refuses, you disappear. If he complies, he becomes irrelevant. And in his world, irrelevance is not a condition that allows for a long retirement. Naomi set the phone on the table and looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she picked it up. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because I've spent 3 years building a case, and I need Min-jae alive and functional long enough to testify. And because... A brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. Because you're a civilian who had nothing to do with any of this, and what's about to happen to you isn't something I'm willing to stand outside of. You want me to cooperate with your investigation. I want you to stay alive, he said. Those 2 things may or may not align depending on the next 12 hours. She thought for a moment. Does Min-jae know about Ryun? No. He needs to know. Yes, he does. But if you call him directly, Ryun will know within minutes because he has access to Min-jae's communication logs. He's had access for over a year. A pause. There's a way to reach Min-jae that Ryun doesn't know about. One channel that was set up before Ryun joined the organization and that Min-jae stopped using when he decided the old precautions were no longer necessary. Why would I know about that? You wouldn't, Oh Jae-won said. But I've been investigating Min-jae for 3 years, and I know about most of the things he stopped thinking about. She sat with that for a moment. Where are you right now? She said. 40 meters from you, gray coat, window seat near the front, reading a newspaper I haven't looked at in 20 minutes. She looked up. He was there, exactly as described. He didn't turn around. He lifted one hand slightly from the newspaper, an acknowledgement, and set it back down. She picked up her coffee cup because she needed something to hold. The coffee was cold. Tell me the channel, she said. He told her. It was an address, not a phone number, not a digital contact, but a physical address. A hardware store in a neighborhood that Min-jae had operated out of in the early years of his organization, before the expansion, before the penthouse and the political connections and the weight of a decade of successful power. The store was still there. The owner was an old man who had known Min-jae for 23 years. There was a system, a specific way of asking for a specific item that the store didn't carry, which would trigger the owner to place a call through a landline that had never been connected to anything digital. Is that secure? She said. It was 17 years ago, Oh Jae-won said. It's secure now because it's been dormant long enough that nobody is watching it. How long do I have before the rival families move? The pause this time was longer. I think they already have, he said. She set down the coffee cup. She stood up. She walked to the front of the shop without hurrying. She did not look at Oh Jae-won as she passed him, but she heard him stand, quietly, efficiently, and understood he was falling in behind her at a distance. Outside, the street was cold and bright and indifferent. She walked to the subway. She took 3 trains. She found the hardware store 40 minutes later, a narrow shop front on a street that had been mostly consumed by newer construction. The store itself an anachronism, its sign hand-painted in a style that was 20 years out of fashion. She went in. The owner was a small, lean man in his late 70s with the specific quality of stillness that she associated with people who had outlasted many things. He looked up when she entered. He gave no indication of recognizing her, which she suspected meant he recognized her completely. She told him she was looking for a replacement part for an old lock mechanism, a specific type that she named using the exact phrase OJ1 had given her. The old man looked at her for a moment. Then he said he didn't carry that, but he could check in the back. He disappeared through a door behind the counter. She stood in the store and waited. The store smelled of metal and oil and old wood. There was a radio on a shelf playing something instrumental and forgettable. 4 minutes later, the old man came back out and said he couldn't find what she needed, but suggested she try a shop on a street he named, and he wrote the street name on a small piece of paper and handed it to her. The street name was a message. She understood it in the way OJ1 had explained. It wasn't a street, it was a coded location, and the location was somewhere Min Jae would understand. She took the paper. She thanked the man. She left. OJ1 was waiting outside, 20 feet down the block. "It's moving," he said when she reached him. He was looking at his phone. "What is?" "The rival families. I have a source inside, but one of 3 contacts I've kept inside for the past 2 years. She just messaged." He turned the phone so Naomi could see the screen. The message was short. 6 words. They found where she works. Tonight. Naomi looked at the screen and felt something clarify inside her. Not calm exactly, but the particular state that exists just past the edge of fear when there is no longer any option except action. The feeling of a decision that has already been made by circumstances. "The art center," she said. "Yes." "The teenagers. Min Jae's people were supposed to make sure they didn't come tonight." "Min Jae's people includes Ryeon." OJ1 looked at her. His expression said what he didn't say out loud, and what he didn't say out loud was that she was correct, and that this was a problem with no clean solution. "Call Min Jae through the old channel," OJ1 said. "The message has been sent through the store. He should be receiving it now, but he needs to hear from you directly. And if Ryeon intercepts it, then we improvise." He looked at her with the specific tired honesty of someone who has been doing a difficult job long enough to have stopped pretending certainty he didn't have. "There are no clean options here, Mrs. Kang. There haven't been for some time. The question is which risk you can live with." She took out the prepaid phone. She dialed the number OJ1 gave her. Another line she hadn't known existed, routed through the hardware store's landline system, reaching a phone that Min Jae kept in a location Ryeon didn't know about. It rang twice. Min Jae answered. "Naomi." His voice was different from this morning, compressed, already operating. "Listen," she said. "Don't speak, just listen." She told him about Ryeon. She told him everything OJ1 had told her, precisely and in order, without editorial, the way he had taught her to transmit information when information was the only tool available. She heard his breathing change. Not much, but she knew how to hear it now. She told him about the art center, about tonight, about the teenagers. When she finished, there was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. "Where are you?" he said. She told him. "Don't move," he said. "I'm coming to you. Not Ryeon, not anyone else. Me." "Min Jae, I know about Ryeon," he said. And the way he said it, flat, with a specific quality of stillness that was not calm but something colder, told her that he had known, or suspected, for longer than tonight. "I've known for 6 days. I was building enough to be certain before I moved." The air went out of her lungs. 6 days, she said. "Yes. And you still sent him to I didn't send him to the arts center. He went on his own, which tells me he's further along in whatever he's planning than I calculated." A pause. "I made an error. I was trying to be certain before I acted, and I gave him time I shouldn't have." She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and looked at the hand holding the phone. "There are teenagers who might be at that building tonight," she said. "Min Jae? Children." "I know." His voice was completely even. "I'm going to handle it." "How?" "Don't ask me that." "I'm asking." A silence. Then, "There are 2 men I trust. Only 2. I'm sending them to the arts center now. I'm going to you. And then..." He stopped. "And then what?" When he answered, she heard something in his voice that she had never once heard in 6 years of knowing him. Not during gang wars, not during investigations, not during the years of accumulated pressure that had slowly unmade their marriage. She heard it now, and it stopped her breath. He sounded afraid. Not of the rival families, not of Ryun's betrayal, not of what the night was about to require of him. "And then I'm going to make a decision," he said quietly, "that I can't take back." She understood, suddenly and completely, that he was not talking about a decision involving violence. She was about to ask him what he meant when Oh-jae-won grabbed her arm. She turned. Across the street, a black van had stopped at the curb. The side door was already opening. Oh-jae-won pulled her sideways into a narrow gap between two buildings before the van door had fully opened. It was not elegant. He moved fast and without asking, his hand closing on her upper arm with the practiced grip of someone who had done this before, and she went with it because her body understood the situation before her mind had finished processing the van. They were in the gap, barely wide enough for two people standing sideways, and Oh-jae-won had his back flat against the brick and was watching the street at the gap's edge with the specific stillness of controlled breathing. Naomi pressed against the opposite wall. Her heart was doing something unreasonable against her ribs. She could hear it. She had not previously believed the expression about hearing your own heartbeat, but she believed it now, the pulse of it thick and too fast in her ears and her throat. On the street, two men climbed out of the van, not running, not drawing attention, moving with the deliberate casualness of people who had done this enough times to know that urgency was what got you noticed. They were looking at storefronts, looking at faces, working a pattern. "They're not certain it's this block," Oh-jae-won said against her ear. His voice was almost nothing, barely pushed air. "They're canvassing. How long before they check the gaps?" 2 minutes, maybe less." She looked at him. "Do you have people?" "I called for backup 20 minutes ago when the message came in. They're 8 minutes out." "That's not 2 minutes." "No," he said. "It isn't." The prepaid phone in her pocket was vibrating. She felt it against her hip, the silent pulse of an incoming call. She pressed it through the fabric to stop the vibration without taking it out, because taking it out meant light from the screen. One of the men on the street had stopped. He was looking toward the gap. Oh-jae-won moved without warning. He stepped out of the gap, back onto the sidewalk, turned away from the man, and walked, not ran, walked, in the opposite direction at a pace that communicated mild purpose. Naomi understood and did the same, stepping out behind him, 6 feet of distance between them, moving the way people moved when they had somewhere reasonable to be. She heard the man take 2 steps in their direction. She did not look back. She heard him stop. She turned the corner and Oh-jae-won was already there waiting, pressed into a doorway. She came in beside him, both of them breathing, the cold making the breath visible, and she tilted her chin down to make the cloud smaller. "They'll reposition the van in 2 minutes," he said. "They're going to figure out the block." Her phone was vibrating again. She took it out. "Min-jae." She answered it. "I see the van," he said. His voice was close. Too close. She turned. Across the intersection, a dark car sat at the curb with its engine off. She could see the shape of him in the driver's seat, the phone at his ear. "Don't come across," she said. "They're canvassing. One of them is 30 feet from the corner." "I know where they are." A pause. "I need you to get to the car. There's an interval. The one on the east side is going back to check with the driver. You have about 40 seconds when neither of them has sight lines to the crossing. You've been watching long enough to know their pattern." "Long enough." His voice was completely flat. 30 seconds. "Go now or wait for the next interval." Oh-jae-won looked at her. She looked at him. "Go," Oh-jae-won said. "I'll come around the long way." She went. She walked across the intersection. Not fast. The same mild purpose pace from before. Her coat, her bag, just a woman crossing a street in the early evening. The car was 40 feet away. Then 30. Then she was at the passenger door and it was unlocked and she got in and Min-jae did not move, did not accelerate, did not do anything that would draw a second look. He waited. 30 seconds later, Oh-jae-won came around the south side of the block and got into the back seat. Min-jae looked at him in the rearview mirror. Something passed between them through that mirror. Not words, not warmth, not any kind of ease. The specific mutual assessment of 2 men in different positions on the same problem, each deciding in real time how much to extend. "Detective," Min-jae said. Mr. Kang, OJ-won said. A 3-second silence that contained an entire negotiation. The Art Center, Min-jae said, ending it. He pulled out slowly into traffic. They didn't speak for 4 blocks. Naomi watched the side mirror and tracked the van, and it did not move, and then they turned and it was out of sight. The city moved around them, ordinary and continuous, the way it always was, the way it had been on every ordinary evening she'd spent in Seoul for 6 years without knowing what moved underneath the ordinary. You're 2 men, she said, at the center. Park and Seo, they've been with me since before Ryun. He said the name without inflection. They're at the center now. The building is clear. No teenagers. You're sure? Park has 2 children of his own. A brief pause. He checked every room. She let the breath out. Ryun, she said. He's there. Min-jae's hands were on the wheel, steady. He went to the center 2 hours ago, I assume to coordinate with whatever the rival families have positioned. He knows, you know. He will, very soon. He turned onto a wider road, increasing speed slightly, merging with traffic. The question is whether he knows before I get there or after. Oh-chae-won leaned forward from the back seat. You can't go in there as an aggressor. If you engage the rival family's people directly, I understand the legal complications of my situation, detective. Do you understand that if you go in there and handle it the way you'd normally handle it, anything you give me afterward is inadmissible and the whole case falls apart? Min-jae was quiet for a moment. I'm not going in there to handle it the way I'd normally handle it. Then what are you going in there to do? Min-jae didn't answer immediately. He made 2 turns. Naomi watched his profile, the jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular controlled quality of his face that she'd spent years learning to read, and had never fully cracked. What you need, he said finally. I'm going in there to get you what you need. Oh-jae-won sat back. The Arts Center came into view 3 blocks ahead. It was dark in the way it was always dark at this hour. The boarded windows, the front steps with their cracked concrete, the plastic bags still moving in the forecourt with the same lost circular motion as this morning, as though it hadn't gone anywhere all day. But there were 2 cars Naomi didn't recognize parked on the side street, and the side entrance, the service door she'd been using as her working entrance, was slightly ajar, showing a thin line of interior light that should not have been there. How many? She said. The family sent 4, maybe 6. Min-jae's eyes moved across the building's exterior in the systematic way of someone reading a tactical situation. Ryun will have told them the building's layout by now. They'll have the main entrance and the service entrance both covered from the inside. Park and Seo. Watching from the building opposite. They won't move until I tell them. He parked 2 blocks east behind a delivery lorry that blocked the sightline to the side street. He turned the engine off. In the silence, the 3 of them sat for a moment in a car that smelled like cold air and old upholstery, and something that might have been fear if fear had a smell, which Naomi was beginning to believe it did. There's something you need to understand, Min-jae said. He was looking straight ahead, through the windshield, at the middle distance. Before we go in, before any of this moves forward, he paused. I made a decision tonight. Before I came to you. Before I knew about the van. Another pause, longer. I called the Financial Crimes Division's intake line, an anonymous call. I arranged a dead drop, documents, drive, full record, everything. Oh-jae-won went completely still in the back seat. Every account, Min-jae said, every offshore transaction, every corrupt alliance, every shipping route, every record from the past 14 years. He turned and looked at Oh-jae-won directly. Including evidence against myself. A silence. You understand what you just said, Oh-jae-won said. I understand exactly what I said. That's... Oh-jae-won stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, stripped of reaction. That's everything I've been building toward for 3 years. I know. Min-jae held his gaze. I want 2 things in return. Naomi is kept out of every document. Her name doesn't appear in any proceeding, any filing, any public record. She was a civilian spouse. She had no knowledge of operations. That is the truth, and I want it legally protected. And the second thing, Min-jae turned back to the windshield. Help me keep her alive through tonight, he said, and then you can have the rest of it. OJ1 was quiet for a long time. My backup arrives in 4 minutes, he said finally. We wait for them. We don't have 4 minutes. Min-jae's phone had lit up on the dash. A message, 2 words, from a number Naomi didn't recognize. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a tightening, almost imperceptible. Rion just moved. He's at the front entrance. That means he knows you're close, Naomi said. It means he's repositioning. He wants to control the exits before I arrive. Min-jae reached under the seat. He came up with something that he set on his knee, and Naomi recognized it by shape, even in the dark of the car, and she didn't say anything about it because there was nothing useful to say. He checked it with the quick, unsentimental efficiency of someone performing a task they have performed many times. Stay behind me. Stay close to the walls. If there's firing... I know how to move in a building, Naomi said. He looked at her. I've been learning the layout for 3 weeks, she said. I know every interior wall, every corridor, every door. I know which sections of floor are weak and which walls are structural. I know where the blind spots are. A beat. The service corridor on the east side, she said. It runs the full length of the building and exits into the alley. If someone needs to move people through without exposure, that's the route. Min-jae looked at her for 2 full seconds. Stay behind me, he said again, but differently than before. They got out of the car. The night was cold and the street was quiet, and somewhere in the distance a siren moved through the city on its own unrelated business, cresting and fading, and then there was nothing but the sound of their feet on the pavement and the particular silence of a block that has been cleared of casual pedestrian traffic without anyone being directly told to clear it. They came at the building from the east. Min-jae moved along the wall with the economy of someone who understood how to be small, and Naomi stayed 2 steps behind and matched his pace without being told to, and OJ1 came behind her with his hand at his side, phone in one hand. The side entrance was ahead, the line of light still showing under the door. Min-jae stopped. He held one hand back, palm out. Stop. She stopped. From inside the building came a sound. Not a voice, not a footstep, but something shifting. The specific quality of interior sound changing as a large space redistributes. Someone was moving inside. Min-jae's hand came down. He moved to the door. He went in. Naomi counted to 3 and followed. The interior was different at night. The work lights were on in the main hall, the harsh temporary kind on stands, making the space too bright in some places and casting thick shadows in others. The mural on the west wall was half visible, the teenager's colors surreal in the flat artificial light. The east wall was Soo-jin's careful measurements, the collapsed northwest corner, the water damage, the floor that would need to come up. 3 men she didn't recognize stood in the main hall. They saw Min-jae at the same time he saw them. The next 4 seconds were the kind that lasted longer than they had any right to. The frozen interval of everyone in a room simultaneously calculating. Then one of the men moved, and Min-jae was already moving, and Naomi pressed herself against the interior wall and moved east toward the service corridor entrance because standing in the middle of the hall was the one thing she absolutely could not do. She heard impact, heard something hit the floor, heard a voice say something in Korean too fast for her to catch, heard Min-jae respond with 2 words, cold and clipped, that she did not understand but understood the register of. She reached the service corridor door. She pushed through. The corridor was narrow and dark and ran exactly as she'd described it, the full eastern length of the building. Emergency lighting at floor level, the kind installed as part of the renovation prep, gave just enough visibility to move quickly. She went north, toward the back of the building. Behind her, she could hear the main hall. In front of her, nothing yet. She reached the storage junction midway and stopped. Rion was there. He was standing at the junction where the service corridor met the small storage room, and he was alone, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not threatening and was not apologetic and was not anything she had a clean name for. It was the expression of someone who has been running a long calculation and has finally arrived at an answer they are not happy about. "Mrs. Kong," he said. She had nothing in her hands. She didn't move. You told him, Ryon said. It wasn't a question. Yes. How long has he known? 6 days, before I told him. Something moved in Ryun's face. A flicker of something that might have been respect, or might have been the recalibration of a man who has discovered his timeline was shorter than he thought. Then he let me run, Ryon said. He knew, and he let me keep moving. He wanted to be certain. He wanted evidence. Ryon looked at her steadily. Smart, even now, always thinking 3 moves ahead. He was quiet for a moment. Is he all right? In the hall? 3 men. He's had worse. Ryon looked at the floor for a second, then back up. I need you to understand something. What I did, the leaks, the records, it wasn't about money. It wasn't about the rival families. I don't care why, she said. No, but you will. He looked at her. I've been feeding information to Jaewon's unit for 14 months. The detective told you I was the leak. He didn't tell you that I'm also his source, that everything he has, the documents, the account records, the evidence, I built that for him. I've been building it deliberately for over a year. His voice was completely level. I didn't betray Min Jae to destroy him. I did it to end this, because he never would have ended it himself, not without being forced to. The corridor hummed around her. Somewhere in the main hall something fell heavily. Why? She said, and this time she meant it differently. Ryon looked at her for a long moment. Because he loves you, he said simply, and he's been too afraid to choose you, so I made sure the choice became unavoidable. His jaw tightened. I knew what I was doing. I knew what it would cost. I accepted that a long time ago. She stared at him. The rival families, she said. The van tonight. The people in the main hall. I couldn't control all of it. Once the records were in circulation, the families moved faster than I'd calculated. Tonight wasn't supposed to get to this. He looked at the corridor wall. I made mistakes. From the main hall, a new sound. Not impact this time, not movement. Voices. Multiple. Coming closer. Ryon straightened. He looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to regret she'd seen on any face tonight. Go, he said. North end of the corridor, alley exit. There's a car. Gray, civilian plate. Parked at the alley's north entrance. Keys are above the left rear wheel. You arranged it. Before tonight went wrong. He looked past her toward the corridor's south end. Go now. She didn't move. What are you going to do? She said. Ryon looked at the junction where the corridor met the main hall, where the voices were coming from. What I should have done a long time ago, he said. Then he walked toward the voices, and Naomi stood in the corridor for 2 seconds, 2 seconds that were their own kind of eternity, and then she turned and ran north. She hit the alley door at full speed and burst out into the cold night air, and the alley was exactly as she'd described it, and the gray car was exactly where Ryon had said, and she was at the rear wheel with her hand scrabbling above it when she heard, from inside the building behind her, a sound she could not interpret and chose not to interpret. A sharp and definitive sound that meant something had ended. Her fingers found the key. She had it in her hand. She turned. Min Jae was coming down the alley toward her at a pace that was almost running, his coat torn at the right shoulder, something dark on his left hand that she did not look at directly. Behind him, Jaewon, phone at his ear, saying something clipped and urgent that she caught in fragments. Units, east entrance now. Min Jae reached her. He was breathing hard. For the first time in 6 years of knowing him, she saw him breathing hard without any architecture of control over it. He looked at the key in her hand, then at her face, and something in his expression broke open in a way she had never once witnessed. Not relief. Something more than relief and less composed than relief. Ryon, she said. His breathing slowed slightly. I know. She stopped. I know, he said again, differently. Blue light was beginning to pulse at the alley's south entrance. Police, Jaewon's backup, arriving in the specific frantic way of units coming into an already moving situation. The night was filling with sound. From the main hall of the Arts Center, through the alley door that still stood open, came the noise of a building being entered by people who moved with institutional authority. Min-jae looked at the building. His empire was already inside it, waiting to be taken. The documents he had dropped were somewhere in a government intake office, sitting in a sealed container with his name on it. And by morning, there would be people with the specific credentials and specific mandate to begin the work of dismantling everything he had spent 14 years building. And it would take a long time, and it would be thorough. And when it was finished, there would be nothing left of the structure he had erected except the damage it had done, and the record of the damage it had done, and whatever restitution he could offer toward it. He knew all of this. He had known it when he made the call. He looked at Naomi. She was standing in the alley with the key to a car she hadn't known existed an hour ago, her coat dirty, her hair pulled loose from whatever she'd put it in this morning, looking at him with an expression that contained too many things for him to read all at once. "I didn't do this to make you come back," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Not emotion, just the physical consequence of the past 40 minutes. "I need you to know that. I didn't destroy it for you. I destroyed it because it was the right thing to do," she said. He looked at her. "Eventually," she said, "even if it took 6 years and a catastrophe and your most trusted lieutenant engineering your own undoing to get you there." She looked at him steadily. "But yes, eventually. The right thing." Behind them, Oh Jae-won had finished his call and was walking toward them with the purposeful, exhausted gait of a man who has reached the far end of a very long investigation and is only beginning to understand what the far end actually looks like. "I need both of you," he said when he reached them. "There are going to be a lot of people with a lot of questions, and the next few hours are going to be—" "I know," Min-jae said. "Mr. Kang." Oh Jae-won stopped in front of him. He looked at the man who had just handed him 3 years of work in a sealed container and then walked into a building to pull a woman out of it. He looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was entirely unreadable. "Don't run." Min-jae looked back at him. "I'm not running," he said. The blue light pulsed at the end of the alley. The art center stood behind them, its clerestory windows still boarded, the mural still half finished on the west interior wall, the east wall with its measurements, the building that was partway through becoming something different from what it had been. Not finished, not yet, but structurally sound and moving in the right direction. Naomi looked at it. She put the car key in her coat pocket. She turned toward the blue light, and Min-jae, standing beside her in the alley with the ruins of his empire radiating outward from every direction, looked at her profile in the pulsing light and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that wasn't already understood, and because the woman standing next to him had just walked through the worst night of her life without once asking him to carry her through it, and understanding that, really understanding it, in his chest and not just in his head, was the thing that finally broke through the last wall he'd kept between himself and the truth of what he had wasted and what he might, if the world allowed it and she allowed it, still have a chance to deserve. He walked toward the light. She walked beside him, not behind him, beside him. For the first time in 6 years, that was exactly where she chose to be, and he knew better than to say a single word about it, and he didn't. The first thing they did was sit in separate rooms. That was how it worked. Oh Jae-won had explained it in the alley before the uniformed officers reached them. Standard procedure, separate interviews, no contact between subjects until initial statements were recorded. He said it with the professional neutrality of a man who understood that the people he was separating had just survived something together and that separating them was a cruelty he couldn't avoid. He said it, and then he did it. And Naomi was walked to a room in a building she'd never been in before, and Min-jae was walked to a different room, and the door between them was not locked but was effectively closed by the weight of process. Naomi sat in a gray chair at a gray table and answered questions for 4 hours. A woman named Detective Inspector Yoon conducted the interview, methodical, unhurried, with the specific patience of someone who understood that the person across the table was not a suspect and could not be pushed the way a suspect could be pushed. She asked about the marriage, about the art center, about the envelope in the market meeting and Ryun's visit and the message from the unknown number, about the coffee shop, about the hardware store, about the alley. Naomi answered all of it. She answered it the way Min-jae had taught her to answer things, which was with precision and without elaboration, saying exactly what she knew and stopping clearly at the edge of what she didn't. She didn't realize until the 3rd hour that she was doing this. That 6 years of proximity to a man who navigated language the way other people navigated minefields had left something in her, some residue of his particular discipline, and that the residue was useful now in ways she hadn't anticipated and felt complicated about. At 2:15 in the morning, Detective Inspector Yoon closed her notebook and told Naomi she was free to go. She sat in the gray chair for a moment after Yoon left the room. Then she stood up, and she picked up her coat, and she walked out. Min-jae was in the corridor. He was sitting on a bench against the opposite wall with his forearms on his knees and his head slightly forward, and he looked up when she came out of the room with the specific alertness of someone who had been listening for that particular door for some time. Someone had given him a white cloth for his hand, not bandaged, just wrapped loosely, already showing through. His coat was gone, and he was in the torn shirt, and he looked, under the fluorescent corridor lights, like a man who had been emptied out and was sitting quietly inside the empty. They looked at each other across the corridor. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She looked at the wrapped hand. "You." "It's minor." He looked at it briefly, then back at her. "I've had worse." "I know." A silence. The corridor had the specific institutional quiet of a building at 3 in the morning. Distant sounds, nothing close, the sense of processes continuing in other rooms without urgency. "They're holding me," he said, formally, as of an hour ago. His voice was level. "The documents I provided. They move quickly when the evidence is complete. Which it is." A pause. "Oh, Jaewon says the arraignment will be within 48 hours. She looked at him. "Do you have representation?" she said. "I've contacted someone." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, just the ghost of the expression that would have been a smile in a different moment. "A good lawyer, not the kind I used before, the kind who is good at what's actually in front of me now." "What's actually in front of you?" He looked at his hands. "A long process," he said. "Cooperation agreements, testimony, asset liquidation. All of it monitored, all of it documented, all of it slow." He paused. "I'm told 3 to 5 years with full cooperation. Could be less." She absorbed this. "And the organization," she said. "It's already gone." He said it without audible grief, which she understood was not the absence of grief, but grief that had already been processed in whatever room they'd kept him in for the past 4 hours. The structure started collapsing the moment the documents entered the intake system. The families moved to absorb pieces of it, but Oh Jae-won's unit was already positioned. Most of the senior structure will be in custody within 72 hours. He looked at her. "It's over." "And Sung-hyun?" "Included." A pause. He was always going to be included. She stood in the corridor and looked at the man who had spent 14 years building something that he had spent one phone call dismantling, and she tried to find inside herself something clean. Clean grief, clean relief, clean anything, and couldn't. What she found instead was the complex and exhausted texture of a situation that had no winners, only people who had made it through and people who hadn't, and a long daylight on the other side of tonight that would ask things of all of them that couldn't be answered yet. "Ryan?" she said. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "He survived," he said. "Injuries. He's in hospital." He paused. "He'll testify. Oh Jae-won has confirmed his status as a source. It will affect his sentencing significantly." She thought about the corridor, the junction, the way Ryan had looked at her when he told her to go, not like a man sacrificing himself, but like a man finally arriving somewhere he'd been walking toward for a long time. "He told me," she said, "what he did." "Why?" Min-jae looked at her. "He said he did it because you'd never choose to end it yourself," she said. "That you loved me, but you were too afraid to choose me over the organization. So he made the choice unavoidable." Min-jae absorbed this in silence. "He was right," he said finally. "I know." "I would have found another way to justify keeping it," he said. "There was always another justification. Another threat to manage. Another reason why dismantling it now was the wrong time. I was very good at reasons." He looked at the floor. 11 years he watched me do that. He understood the pattern better than I did. He paid an enormous price for understanding it. "Yes," Min-jae said. "He did." A pause. I'll make sure he knows I understand that, when it's possible to make sure of things. The corridor was quiet. An officer came and told Min-jae he needed to return to the processing room. Min-jae stood. He was stiff. More than the hand. She could see it in the way he came up from the bench. The careful distribution of weight that meant ribs or something adjacent. He didn't say anything about it. He straightened and looked at her. "Where will you go?" he said. "Ji-young's." He nodded. He started to turn toward the officer, and then he stopped and turned back. He looked at her with an expression she had no category for. It wasn't love, exactly. Or not only love, it was something more complicated and more honest than love. Something that had been stripped of the romantic and left only the essential. The face of a man who sees something clearly for the first time in years and knows he cannot act on what he sees and accepts that. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. And she meant it the way she'd never meant it before. Not as acceptance, not as forgiveness yet, but as acknowledgement. The thing he was sorry for was real, and the sorry was real, and she knew it, and she said so. He walked away down the corridor. She watched him go. Then she walked in the other direction and pushed through a door into the cold night air and stood outside on the steps of the building and let the cold reach her. It took a long time for a cab. She didn't mind. Ji-young was awake when she got there, sitting at the kitchen table with tea she'd been making and remaking for hours. And when Naomi came through the door, Ji-young stood up and looked at her sister for a long moment without speaking, cataloging her the way older sisters catalog damage. "You're all right," Ji-young said. Not a question. "I'm all right," Naomi said. Ji-young nodded. She poured tea. They sat at the kitchen table until the sky outside began to change. The particular dark blue of very early morning before any actual light appears, just the night thinning at its edges. Ji-young asked some questions, and Naomi answered some of them and left others for another time. And Ji-young, who knew her sister well enough to understand which silences to leave alone, let the unanswered ones go. At some point, Naomi put her head down on her arms at the kitchen table and slept. She didn't dream. She woke to the smell of coffee and daylight at the window and the sound of Ji-young on the phone in the other room, managing something ordinary, a contractor, a scheduling conflict, the texture of a normal day. She sat up, her neck hurt from the table. Her coat was still on. The teacups had been moved to the sink. She sat at the table in the ordinary morning light and felt the previous night settle into her the way large things settle. Slowly, finding their level, taking up the space they would permanently occupy. Then she got up. She washed her face. She borrowed a clean shirt from Ji-young's closet. She drank the coffee that was on the counter and stood at the window that looked out over the narrow alley and the convenience store with the buzzing sign, and she looked at it, the ordinary view from the ordinary window, and felt something that was quiet and not uncomplicated, but was, at its bottom, survivable. She went back to work. Not immediately. There were days of statements and legal consultations and a meeting with OJ1 that lasted 3 hours and confirmed what she already knew, which was that her name would not appear in any public proceeding, that her status was clearly and legally established as uninvolved civilian. There were phone calls with her firm in Atlanta. There was a conversation with her mother that she had been avoiding for longer than the current situation warranted, and that turned out to be less terrible than she'd feared, because her mother was a woman who had survived considerable things of her own and had earned a kind of practical compassion that didn't require the full story to be useful. There was time. A week. Then 2. The city continued doing what cities do, which is to say it absorbed the collapse of Min-jae's organization into its general texture without visible disruption, the way water absorbs a stone. A disturbance, then a spreading of rings, then the surface returning to what it was from a distance, even though underneath, for a while, things were rearranged. She went back to the Arts Center at the beginning of the second week. Soo-jin was there with a revised structural report and a slightly less disapproving expression than usual, which Naomi had learned to interpret as high praise. They walked the building together. The north section of the roof had been repaired over the previous 2 weeks by the crew that had kept working through everything because nobody had told them to stop and they had a job to do. The collapsed northwest corner had been shored up pending full reconstruction, The east wall's water damage was contained, and the west wall, the mural. The teenagers had come back. She hadn't told them to. Nobody had told them to. They had simply appeared one afternoon while she wasn't there, according to the crew foreman's account, 4 of them with backpacks and paint, and they had gone to the wall and continued working, and now there were 6 of them. And the mural was 3/4 complete, and it was becoming something she hadn't expected. Not the bright generic hopefulness she might have predicted from teenagers given a wall, but something more complicated, more layered, with a darkness at its edges that acknowledged the neighborhood's actual history, and a center that moved toward light anyway. She stood in front of it one afternoon and looked at it for a long time. A girl of about 16 with paint on both forearms came and stood beside her. "Is it okay?" the girl said. "It's more than okay," Naomi said. The girl looked at it. "The corner took us a while. We couldn't decide what to put there." "What did you decide?" "We put what was true," the girl said, simply, as though this were the obvious answer. Naomi looked at the corner. It was dark there, deep blue-black, the color of a city at 3 in the morning. But there were lights in it, small ones, not sentimental, not decorative, just present, just holding their place in the dark. She thought about a corridor, a bench, a man with a wrapped hand and a torn shirt telling her the truth about 3 to 5 years the way you tell someone the truth when you finally stopped managing what they're allowed to know. The months moved. Min-jae cooperated fully. She knew this from Oh-jae-won, who provided updates with the professional brevity of a man maintaining appropriate distance from a situation that was no longer operationally his concern, but that he watched with what she understood was something more than professional interest. The testimony progressed. The asset liquidation was handled by a court-appointed administrator. A portion, a significant portion, was directed, at Min-jae's formal request and the court's approval, into a restitution fund for neighborhoods damaged by the syndicate's operations over 14 years. The Art Center was the first project funded by it. She heard this on a Tuesday morning from the foundation administrator, and she sat down in her temporary site office, a converted storage room with a folding table and a space heater, and looked at the notification on her laptop and thought about what it meant to take money with that provenance and build something good with it. She sat with it long enough to feel the full weight of the question. Then she thought about the girl with paint on her forearms, about what was true, about the darkness with lights in it. She accepted the funding. She worked. Spring arrived the way spring arrives in Seoul. Not gently, not all at once, but in stages. The cold releasing its grip incrementally until one morning you step outside and the air is different in some quality you notice before you can name it. The cherry blossoms came. The neighborhood around the Arts Center changed in the particular way that neighborhoods change when a building at their center stops being hollow. People began to use the block differently, taking a route they hadn't taken before, stopping, looking at the facade that had been cleaned and repainted in a color Naomi had chosen after 2 weeks of deliberation. The grand reopening was on a Saturday in late April. It was not large. She hadn't wanted large. She'd wanted functional, a working building used by the people it was built for, opened on a day when those people could come and be in it. Not a ceremony about the building, but an introduction to it. There was food that a local vendor provided. There were children everywhere, the after-school group that had been meeting in the building for 2 months already, plus families who came because the block had changed and they were curious. The mural was finished. It covered the entire west interior wall from floor to the high ceiling, and it was the best thing in the building, and everyone who came in stopped and looked at it, and almost nobody tried to describe it because some things described themselves. Naomi stood at the back of the main hall in the middle of the afternoon and watched the building do what she'd understood it could do when she'd stood in front of it in January in the cold and looked at the boarded windows and thought, this is fixable. She felt him before she saw him. The particular quality of the room changing, a pressure shift, the specific thing that happened to the air in any space Min-jae occupied that she had felt the very first time she'd been in the same room as him, and had never been able to rationally account for, and had eventually stopped trying to account for. She turned. He was at the back, near the entrance. He was not in a suit. He wore ordinary clothes, dark jacket, no tie. the clothes of a person trying not to be anything in particular in a public space. He was thinner than he'd been in the alley. The months showed on him differently than on other people, not in collapse, but in a stripping away, an attrition of the surface qualities that had always given him the particular solidity of a man who has constructed his exterior deliberately. What remained was less architectural, more actual. He was looking at the mural. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched him look at it. She watched his face in the mural's light, the colors from the west wall catching on him, the dark blue corner with its small lights. She watched him stand still in the way he stood still when something was moving through him that he wasn't going to perform for anyone. Private. Unarchitectured. Then he looked for her. He found her in 3 seconds. They looked at each other across the main hall of the building she had spent 4 months making livable, in the middle of the afternoon, in the light and noise of the event she had built, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then Naomi walked to him. Not because she had decided to forgive him, not because the months had resolved the things that were broken or filled the places that had been emptied by 6 years of careful exclusion. She walked to him because he was there, and she was there. And the building around them was full of children and color and the specific ordinary noise of a community inhabiting a space that had been waiting for them. And in that context, in that specific, hard-won, improbable context, she wanted to say something true. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her without trying to make his expression anything. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired," he said. "How long?" 2 more years, minimum, then supervised release, then a period of restriction. He said it factually. "I'm in the middle of it." "I know." She paused. "Oh, Chaewon keeps me informed." Something moved in his face. "That's—" He stopped. "Thank you for letting him." She looked at the mural over his shoulder. "Ryun's out of hospital," she said. "Ji Young told me. She heard it somewhere." "I know, I've been told." "Have you—" "Not yet. When it's appropriate." His voice was careful around the name. Not cold, but careful, the way you are careful with something that costs you to touch. "There are things to say that I need to say in person, when the process allows it." She nodded. Around them, the hall moved and breathed. A child ran past them and stopped to look at the mural and said something emphatic to a smaller child behind her, a verdict delivered with total authority. "The building is extraordinary," Min-jae said. He was looking at it, at all of it, the walls and the light from the opened clerestory windows that were doing what she'd known they would do when she'd stood in the space in January and looked up at the boards covering them. "What you did here." "What the community did," she said. "I just worked out the structure." He looked at her. "That's what you do," he said quietly. She didn't answer that. She put her hand in her coat pocket. Her fingers found the ring she'd put there this morning. Not the old one, not the one she'd set on the table on the night of their anniversary and left when she walked out. That ring was somewhere. She didn't know exactly where, and it didn't matter. This was a different ring. Simple. She'd bought it 3 weeks ago, not with any specific plan, just because she'd passed a small shop and stopped, and because some part of her had needed to hold the decision in a physical form while she figured out what the decision was. She took it out. She held it in her palm. He looked at it. "I'm not returning the old one," she said. "That ring belonged to 2 people hiding from each other." His face did something that started with his eyes, a tightening at the corners, a brightness that was not performance, that was the involuntary response of a man receiving something he had not expected and is not sure he has the right to receive. "This one," she said, "belongs to 2 people who know the truth." He looked at the ring in her palm, then at her face, then at the ring again. "I'm not asking you to come back," she said. "That's not what this is. You're in the middle of something that needs to finish on its own terms, and I understand that." She paused. "But I'm also not going to stand here in the building we both helped make possible and pretend I don't know what I know." She looked at him steadily. "I know who you were, and I know who you chose to become, and I know the difference cost everything. That matters to me. What people choose at cost matters to me." His hands were at his sides. She took one of them and placed the ring in it and closed his fingers around it. He looked at his closed hand. "Can we start over?" he said. His voice had the quality of something said very quietly because it could not be said at all in any louder register. She looked at him. "No," she said. His face fell by a fraction, controlled immediately, but she saw it. Then she reached out and took his closed hand and held it, her fingers over his, the ring between them. "Let's start honestly," she said. The hall breathed around them. The mural held its lights in its dark corner. The clerestory windows did what she'd known they would, threw light in long diagonals across the floor, the specific light of late spring afternoon, warm in particular and not available at any other hour of any other season in quite this way. Outside, the neighborhood that had been neglected and then damaged and then neglected again was doing what neglected things do when someone is patient with them. It was becoming. Min-jae looked at Naomi's hand over his, and his jaw was tight, and he breathed in once, deliberately, the kind of breath that is not about oxygen, but about holding something together that wants to come apart. He didn't come apart. He turned his hand over under hers and held it properly. They stood in the hall in the light and the noise, and they didn't say anything else, because everything that needed to be said had been said. And what was left was not words, but the long, unscripted, imperfect work of two people beginning something. Not beginning again, not returning to what they'd had, but beginning the thing they should have built from the first day and hadn't, because they hadn't been honest enough, either of them, to build it. That honesty had cost them 6 years. It had cost others more. There was no clean accounting for that. There was only what came after. The building, the mural, the light from the windows, the children who had no knowledge of what this place had almost not been, who inhabited it with the absolute unsentimental present tense of people who simply needed somewhere to go and had found it. Oh Jae-won arrived at the event at 4 in the afternoon, late, in the way of a man who had been trying to decide whether to come at all. He stood at the entrance for a moment and looked at the hall and found Naomi across the room and gave the brief, functional nod of a man who doesn't do sentiment in public, but wanted her to know he was there. She nodded back. He looked around the hall. He looked at the mural for a long time. He got a cup of tea from the vendor table and stood near the entrance drinking it, watching the room. At some point, he looked at Min-jae standing beside Naomi. Min-jae looked back at him. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not friendship, nothing so resolvable as either of those things. Just the acknowledgement of two men who had been on opposite sides of something enormous and had both, for reasons that were entirely their own, ended up in the same place on a Saturday afternoon in a building full of children while the spring light came through windows that had been boarded since before any of this began. Oh Jae-won looked away first. He finished his tea. He left quietly, without saying goodbye to either of them, which was not rudeness but preference. The preference of a man who understood that exits, when the work is done, should be clean. The event wound down in the way of afternoons. Gradually, the families leaving in clusters, the children extracted one by parents and older siblings. The vendor packed up. The after-school group lingered longest, the teenagers sitting against the west wall underneath the mural they'd made, talking about something that had nothing to do with any of this. Naomi walked the building one last time as the hall emptied. She walked the east wall. She checked the windows. She stood in the northwest corner where the ceiling had collapsed and looked at the repair. Solid, correctly done, no longer a visible wound. She went into the service corridor and walked its length and came out the north end into the alley. The alley was ordinary. No gray car, no running. Just an alley. In the early evening, behind a building that was now a building and not a wound. She went back inside. Min-jae was waiting near the entrance. He'd been asked, politely, by one of the foundation staff who didn't know who he was, if he could help fold the temporary chairs that had been set out for the afternoon, and he had done it. She came back in to find him folding metal chairs with the same focused attention he'd given to everything in his life, every task at whatever scale, and she stood for a moment and watched him doing this ordinary thing. He looked up. "Ready?" she said. He set the last chair with the others. "Yes," he said. They walked out together. The street was quiet in the way of Saturday evenings, the light going amber and long across the pavement, the neighborhood settling into the part of the day that belongs to people walking slowly. They walked without particular destination. 2 blocks, 3. Past the convenience store with the buzzing sign that had been there outside Ji Young's window all winter. Past the hardware store where an old man kept a communication channel nobody used anymore. Past the subway entrance where she'd stood in January and watched the city and decided to be afraid in a productive direction. They walked until Min Jae said he needed to return. The conditions of his cooperation agreement restricted his movements after a certain hour, and he was careful, she could tell, to be careful about it, to not give any opportunity for the process to be complicated by his own failures of compliance. They stopped on a corner. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Same time next week," she said. "The building will be open to the after-school group. You could come and watch how it works." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that," he said. She nodded. She turned. She walked back toward Ji Young's, toward the spare room with the intermittent radiator and the window that looked at the ordinary alley, where she had landed when she walked out of the penthouse 4 months ago, with nothing but her coat and the knowledge of what she couldn't keep living inside. The city moved around her, indifferent and continuous and full of its own business. She walked. Behind her, Min Jae stood on the corner for a moment in the amber light before turning in his own direction. Neither of them looked back. It wasn't indifference. It was, after everything, the most honest thing. Two people who had finally stopped performing for each other, walking separately through the same city with the same weight and the same knowledge and the same long, difficult, open-ended work still ahead of them, and choosing, without drama and without guarantee, to do it. The building stood on its street. The lights were on inside.